My name is Mara Whitfield. I am 39 years old, and on the 17th of May, at exactly 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting in the passenger seat of a pearl-white Range Rover on the corner of Broad Street and Meeting Street in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, watching a woman in a wireless headset sprint out of the double oak doors of Magnolia Terrace and frantically dial her phone for the third time in 4 minutes. That woman was Simone Petit, my sister's $14,000 wedding planner. A woman so detail-oriented that she had personally selected each of the 42 floral arrangements inside that building, and who had apparently never once looked up who owned it. The phone in my hand buzzed. It was my husband, Elliot. I answered on the first ring. He said very quietly, "They've realized." I said, "I know. I can see Simone from the car." He paused, then asked, "Are you ready?" I looked up at those front steps, the hand-laid tabby concrete steps we had spent 3 weeks arguing with a heritage contractor about restoring. And I thought about a Tuesday evening in December, 17 months earlier, when I had sat at my parents' dining room table on Rutledge Avenue and listened to my mother tell me, in a voice she usually reserved for correcting service staff, "Becca doesn't want you at her wedding, and frankly, neither do I." I didn't cry that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her to explain herself. I just reached down, unfolded my napkin from my lap, placed it very neatly beside my plate, and said, "All right." 2 words. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that the man I had quietly married 4 years earlier at the Colleton County Clerk's office on a Thursday morning with 2 witnesses and a $32 filing fee owned the ground their $150,000 dream was standing on. This is that story. To understand the 17th of May, you have to understand the Hargrove family, not the version they performed at First Baptist on Sunday mornings, or the one on the Christmas card they sent every year with a portrait taken by a professional photographer in matching cream sweaters, but the real version. The one that lived inside the 4-bedroom colonial revival on Rutledge Avenue in Charleston. The house my father Robert Hargrove had inherited from his mother and had spent 30 years quietly running into a state of respectable but fragile debt, a debt my mother, Donna Hargrove, disguised with fresh paint, good table linens, and the unwavering belief that appearances were more important than nearly anything else in the world. My father was 65 years old. He had worked for 32 years as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company in North Charleston, before retiring 3 years earlier on a pension that I knew, from one brief and painful conversation about it, was considerably smaller than he had planned for. He was a gentle man by nature, with my grandmother's pale blue eyes and a habit of going very still and looking at the nearest window whenever a conversation became difficult, which in our household was frequently. He loved both his daughters in the way that some men love things they don't entirely understand, at a careful distance, through folded bills and birthday cards and the single firm pat on the shoulder that was meant to contain more than his words could carry. My mother was 63. She had been beautiful once in the way that women who've always been told so carry it into age, in the lift of her chin, in the particular way she moved through a room with the quiet assumption that she would be noticed. She had not worked outside our home since the year I was born, and she had built her entire identity around the family, with the focused intensity of a woman who had no backup plan. She chaired the garden committee at church. She organized the neighborhood holiday tour every year without exception. She knew everyone on Rutledge Avenue's business and shared none of her own. She was not a cruel woman by nature. She was something more complicated than cruel. She was a woman who had placed every piece of her pride and her sense of safety into one daughter, and I was the other one, my sister Rebecca. Becca was 33 years old. She was 4 inches taller than me, prettier in the way our mother had always been pretty, and she had inherited our mother's particular gift for performing warmth without necessarily feeling it in full. She was a marketing coordinator at a firm downtown with a corner-facing desk she mentioned often. She was engaged to Preston Alcott, 35, a structural engineer from Columbia with a firm handshake, a wide jaw, and a sincere and uncomplicated devotion to my sister that I will acknowledge was entirely real. Preston was not a bad person. He was simply a man who loved a woman and did not yet fully understand the architecture of the family he was marrying into. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me. Becca and I were not always what we became. When I was 9 and she was 7 and we shared a room with matching daisy bedspreads, we had been close in the way sisters are close before the family decides who everyone is going to be. We had a made-up game called Island Store where we traded imaginary goods from our beds as if they were two islands separated by the ocean of the rug between us. I have not forgotten that. I do not want to. But by the time we were teenagers, the machinery of our household had made its decision. She was the one my mother described as easy. I was the one she described in that particular careful tone as a lot, not difficult, not a problem, just a lot. Too much feeling, too many questions, too many needs that didn't conveniently arrange themselves into the shape my mother preferred. The pattern established itself quietly, the way most patterns in families do, through accumulation, through the small things that are each individually explainable and together form something much larger. On the afternoon of my college graduation in May of 2008, my mother arrived 90 minutes after the ceremony began because she had been at Becca's high school spring concert and could not leave at intermission. When I found them in the crowd afterward, she pulled me into a brief hug and said, "You look tired. Was it not a good day?" I had graduated magna cum laude from the College of Charleston after 4 years of working a part-time job to supplement what my parents gave me. Nobody mentioned that, not once, that whole evening. 4 years later, when I accepted a position in Atlanta and told my family I was moving, my mother sat at the kitchen table with an expression she had perfected over decades. Not quite a frown, not quite disappointment, but inhabiting the precise territory between them, and said, "I just think it's a shame you can never be happy with what's here." I had a starting salary of $61,000 and a moving truck arriving on Saturday. I said, "I am happy." She said, "If you say so, sweetheart." That was the end of it. My father looked at the window. Becca, home for the weekend from college, said nothing. I drove to Atlanta the following week in a rental car with 2 suitcases and a small box of kitchen things, and I did not look back. But the clearest example, the one that set the exact terms for everything that followed, happened on the 29th of October, 2 years before the wedding. I had come home for a long weekend visit and made what I later understood to be a mistake. Over dinner, I mentioned that I had recently started a property consulting firm with my then-boyfriend Elliot. I want to be precise about exactly what I said. I said, "We're working on some commercial renovation projects in Charleston and the surrounding area. Things are going very well." My mother looked at Elliot, this quiet, composed man who had ordered the lamb and spent the entire meal asking my father polite and genuine questions about his retirement, about what he missed and what he didn't, and said, "So you flip houses?" Elliot said, "Not exactly. We focus on commercial property acquisition and event space development." My mother smiled the smile she used when she was not impressed but preferred not to appear rude. My father nodded without looking up from his plate. Becca, who had been texting Preston under the table, said, "So like you just buy run-down buildings?" Elliot said, "Sometimes yes." She said, "That sounds exhausting." And then my mother said something I have never forgotten. She said it lightly, with that precise register she used when she wanted something to land without taking responsibility for landing it. She said, "Mara has always been attracted to projects." She meant Elliot. She meant his work. She meant me, for choosing him. I didn't defend him, not because I agreed with a word of it, but because I had learned over many years that the quietest response to my mother's judgments was no response at all. To respond was to participate in the frame she had built. I had stopped stepping into her frames. What my mother did not know at that dinner table, what she would not know for another 2 years, was that Elliot's company, Whitfield Event Properties, LLC, had 3 days earlier closed on the commercial acquisition in downtown Charleston for $2,300,000. She did not know that we had already begun the architectural drawings for the renovation of the building that would become Magnolia Terrace. She did not know that within 14 months, That building would be featured in Charleston Home and Garden magazine under the headline, "The Most Beautiful New Venue in the Low Country." She did not know any of this because she had never asked. She had looked at my quiet husband, formed a judgment in under a minute, and returned her full attention to Becca's new apartment and whether the neighborhood was safe. I once counted the number of questions my mother had asked Elliot about himself over the course of 4 years of knowing him. I did this not out of bitterness, but simply as a matter of record, the way you might inventory a space before deciding what to do with it. The number was 3. 3 questions in 4 years. Becca announced her engagement to Preston at a Sunday brunch in September, 14 months before the wedding date. The table was set for 9. My mother had made shrimp and grits casserole from scratch, a dish she reserved for occasions she considered genuinely significant. When Preston got down on one knee in my parents' living room after brunch, with a round solitaire diamond in a pale blue Tiffany box, my mother burst into tears of real joy. The first time I had seen her cry with that particular kind of happiness in perhaps a decade. She held Becca's face in both hands and said, "My baby." She hugged Preston. She hugged his parents, Gary and Linda Alcott, who had driven up from Columbia for the occasion. She turned to my father and said, "Robert, can you believe it?" My father looked out the window. He was smiling, the real smile he kept for moments he couldn't contain. I hugged my sister. I said, "Congratulations, I mean it." She hugged me back briefly and said, "Thank you." It was the warmest exchange we had managed in 2 years, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds. The planning began immediately and completely. My mother assumed control the way she assumed control of everything, with total enthusiasm, absolute certainty in her own vision, and a genuine belief that this was not control but love. The guest list reached 212 by October. Simone Pettit was retained the following week for a fee of $14,000. Which Becca mentioned to me over a text message in a tone that communicated she expected me to register the significance. The venue search took 3 weeks. On the 22nd of October, Simone Pettit sent the signed event contract and a deposit check for $22,500 to Whitfield Event Properties, LLC for the exclusive use of Magnolia Terrace on the 17th of May for a private wedding and reception not to exceed 220 guests. I found out on a Thursday evening at 7:43 when the contract confirmation landed in the shared business inbox Elliot and I maintained for Whitfield Event Properties. I sat at our kitchen table on East Bay Street for a long time. I read the contract twice, slowly, from the beginning. I looked at the deposit figure. I looked at the event date. I looked at the client name at the top of the agreement, Rebecca Hargrove and Preston Alcott. I did not say anything right away. I just sat with it. There is a particular quality to the silence that comes after a thing you did not plan for, arrives and turns out to be exactly what you needed. That was the silence I was sitting in. Elliot came in from the back room at 8:15 and found me at the table. He looked at my face. Then he looked at the laptop screen. He sat down across from me and read the contract without a word. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you want me to decline it?" I thought about that. I said, "No." He said, "Mara." I said, "No. Honor the contract exactly as written. Process every payment. Fulfill every obligation. Exactly as written. I want it to be the most beautiful event we have ever hosted." He looked at me carefully in the way he did when he was making sure he fully understood what I meant. He said, "You understand what you're doing." I said, "I understand exactly what I'm doing." He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. We didn't speak again for a long time. The ceiling fan turned above us. Outside on East Bay Street, the evening traffic moved past in the blue dark, and somewhere across the city on Rutledge Avenue, my mother was probably already on the phone describing the extraordinary venue her daughter had secured for the most important day of her life. 2 months after the contract was signed, the Tuesday in December arrived. My parents hosted a holiday dinner the table with the leaf in it, the good china, the cream candles my mother ordered each November from a shop on King Street. There were 8 of us, my parents, Becca and Preston, Gary and Linda Alcott visiting for the week, Elliot and me. We were nearly through the main course, my mother's standing rib roast, which she only made for 2 occasions a year, when she set her fork down, touched the corner of her napkin to her lips, and said, in a tone I recognized immediately as prepared, "I want to talk about the wedding." The table attended. She smiled at Becca, then at Preston, then let her eyes settle on me with a different expression altogether. Something composed and decided, she said, "We thought very carefully about what we want the day to feel like. Becca and I have talked at great length." She paused. "We think it's best if Mara isn't included in the wedding party." I said nothing. She continued, "There's been tension in this family over the years. There have been difficulties. We want the day to be peaceful and joyful for everyone who is there, and we feel this is genuinely the better choice." Linda Alcott had her water glass raised halfway to her mouth, and she held it there, perfectly motionless. My father was looking at the window. Elliot sat beside me with one hand flat on his thigh, his shoulders completely still. Becca said, "It's not personal." I looked at her directly. She held my gaze for 4 seconds and then looked down at her plate. I said, "Am I invited as a guest?" My mother tilted her head slightly, the way she did when delivering something she had rehearsed. "I think it's truly better if you're not there at all, sweetheart, for everyone's sake." The word sweetheart landed the way it always landed from her, wrapped in silk and carrying a blade. Preston cleared his throat very quietly. Gary Alcott examined the ceiling. I did not look at either of them. I unfolded my napkin from my lap, placed it neatly beside my plate, reached for my water glass, took one slow sip, set it down. I said, "All right," 2 words. And I meant them, because sitting across that table in the candlelight, I already knew something my mother did not. I knew that the name on the ownership deed at the Charleston County Register of Deeds was Whitfield Event Properties, LLC. And I knew that Elliot Whitfield and I had been married for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and no one at that table had ever asked us a single question about what we had built together. Elliot and I drove home in 22 minutes of complete silence. The city slid past the windows. When we got inside our apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed. He sat beside me. He said, "Tell me what you're thinking." I said, "I'm thinking that Simone Petit wired $22,500 last month into a company my family has never asked about. I'm thinking the remaining balance of $127,500 is due in 3 installments between now and April. I'm thinking every dollar of it will clear our account. And I'm thinking that on the 17th of May, the most beautiful venue in Charleston will also be the most important address in this city." He said, "What do you want to do with that?" I said, "Nothing. I want to do absolutely nothing. I want to go to work and build our business and let this unfold exactly as it will without my interference." He was quiet. "Then you're certain?" I said. "Completely." That was the moment I stopped being the daughter who was never quite enough, and started becoming the woman they had always underestimated. The months between December and May moved the way time moves when you are building something real. Not fast, not slow, but steady. With a sense of forward direction that keeps the days from blurring together, I tracked each payment installment as it arrived. The second deposit of $42,000 came through on the 14th of February, wired from Simone's event management firm account. I receipted it, filed it, noted it in the ledger, and went back to work. The third installment of $42,500 arrived on the 8th of April, accompanied by a 47-page event specification document that Simone had couriered, in a sealed manila envelope with her firm's logo embossed on the flap, to the Whitfield Event Properties office on Calhoun Street, where I worked 3 days a week and where our name was on a small brushed metal plate beside the door. I read all 47 pages with genuine care. Simone Petit was extraordinarily thorough. The document covered the ceremony layout in the East Garden, the reception seating configuration in the main hall, the catering contract with a firm I knew and respected, the florist delivery schedule, the sound and lighting technical requirements, the photography team's access windows for the whole day, the timeline from 9 in the morning through 11:30 that night. She had specified the exact placement of each of the 42 floral arrangements, including the measurements from the anchor walls. She had coordinated a shuttle service running continuously from the Francis Marion Hotel on King Street. She had secured a noise ordinance permit for a live string quartet during the outdoor ceremony. The whole document was meticulous and genuinely impressive. I made a mental note to tell her so. I told no one, not my closest friend Dinah, who had been quietly furious on my behalf since December, and who would have found it impossible to keep a secret of this size. Not my cousin Trina, who had been softly angry on my behalf for years, and who would have told exactly the right person at exactly the wrong moment. Not a single person outside of Elliot. I answered Simone's venue coordinator emails from our general business address, professionally and promptly, as I would for any client. I attended 3 on-site walkthroughs conducted by our venue manager, Hector Cruz, a meticulous and warm man who had been with us since we opened and who handled every event with the same care, whether it was a corporate dinner for 40 or a wedding for 200. I made sure the East Garden was replanted with fresh gardenias in early March because the specification document had emphasized a gardenia-heavy floral concept, and I wanted the grounds to earn every word Simone had written about them. The main hall's hardwood floors, a century-old heart pine that we had spent 11 months locating, sourcing, and hand-laying, were already scheduled for refinishing in April, and I personally confirmed the completion date was no later than the 1st of May. I ordered 2 new statement chandeliers for the foyer from a glasswork studio in Savannah. I had the exterior lighting recalibrated to cast a warmer tone on the front facade after 7 in the evening. I did all of this not as strategy. I did it because Magnolia Terrace was ours, and I wanted it to be more beautiful on the 17th of May than it had ever been. Because that is the part no one in my family had thought to look at. In the 4 years since that dinner, where my mother had dismissed Elliot as someone who bought run-down buildings, Whitfield Event Properties had grown from 1 acquisition to a portfolio of 4 commercial event properties across the Lowcountry. Magnolia Terrace alone had hosted 114 events. Our revenue for the previous calendar year had come to $1,840,000, a figure that would mean nothing to my mother except as an abstraction, but which meant to me the sum of 4 years of early mornings, difficult negotiations, permit battles, contractor disputes, staffing decisions, and the patient and occasionally exhausting work of building something from nothing. I managed operations entirely. Elliot managed acquisitions and investor relationships. We had 5 full-time staff and 17 contracted vendors who worked with us regularly. We had been featured in 3 publications, on 2 wedding industry platforms, and our Saturday booking waitlist ran 14 months out. All of this had happened while I drove to Rutledge Avenue for holidays and listened to my mother describe Elliot's work as projects. In January, we hosted a corporate gala for a pharmaceutical company from Atlanta, 180 guests in the main hall, a 14-piece band, a 7-course dinner. I was on site from 8 in the morning until midnight. At 11:45 that night, while the catering team was clearing the last of the tables and the band was breaking down their equipment in the foyer, I stood in the center of the East Garden by myself in the cold January air and looked up at the back facade of Magnolia Terrace, lit from below. The restored Italianate cornices, the original 16-pane windows, the climbing wisteria we had allowed to stay along the south wall because the heritage architect said it was older than the Civil War. I thought about the first time I stood in this garden, which had been a tangle of overgrowth and broken brick when we bought it. Elliot had stood beside me in the November cold 3 years earlier and said, "What do you think?" And I had said, "I think it's worth it." Every difficult thing we had done since was contained in that sentence. In February, I sat across from an attorney named Marcus Webb at his office on Broad Street to review the annual operating agreements for all 4 Whitfield Event Properties holdings. The meeting lasted 3 hours and covered the revenue performance, the insurance structures, the terms of our investor agreements, and the projected acquisition timeline for a fifth property we were considering in Beaufort. I drove home afterward along the waterfront with the radio off and thought about the fact that my mother believed her son-in-law bought rundown buildings. I was not angry. I was something quieter than that. I was simply aware of the distance between what they believed and what was true, and I had stopped feeling the need to close it for them. In March, Elliot and I celebrated our 4th wedding anniversary at a small restaurant on Chalmers Street that we had been to twice before. Unpretentious, warm, the kind of place that doesn't need to announce itself. He gave me a first edition of a book I had been looking for 2 years. I gave him a framed print of the original architectural survey of Magnolia Terrace from 1861, which I had found at an estate sale in Beaufort and had restored. We talked about the Beaufort property. We talked about hiring a second venue manager to expand Hector's team. We did not talk about the wedding. We didn't need to. 6 weeks before the wedding, in late March, I was reviewing vendor confirmations at the Calhoun Street office when an email came in from Simone's team with the subject line, "Final guest meal preferences." I confirmed receipt, forward to catering, and then sat for a moment looking at the guest list at the bottom of the email. 212 names. My parents were listed as Robert and Donna Hargrove. Preston's parents as Gary and Linda Alcott. Becca's bridesmaids by name. Every +1. 212 people who would stand in the rooms of a building Elliot and I had chosen, purchased, argued over, restored, and poured nearly $3 million into. I ran my finger down the list. My name was not on it. I had known that. It still registered as a fact in my body in a way that took a moment to settle. I closed the email and went back to work. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning. She said, "I'm calling to make sure we're all on the same page." I said, "Of course." She said, "I need you to understand that I can't have you at that venue." I said, "I understand." She said, "I don't want any drama, Mara. Not that day." I said, "There won't be any drama from me. You have my word." She seemed satisfied with that. She said, "I just didn't want there to be any awkwardness." I said, "I appreciate you calling to let me know." And I genuinely meant that, because she had just confirmed 2 weeks out that she still had no idea. If you are still watching right now, I want you to stop for a moment and drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been told you weren't welcome somewhere by someone who had absolutely no idea what you were carrying? Because the rest of the story is everything that happened from that phone call forward. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now. We tell these stories every single week, and we are just getting started. On the morning of the 17th of May, Elliot left our apartment on East Bay Street at 6:45 wearing the charcoal suit I had quietly selected for him 2 months earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just beautifully cut and quietly authoritative. The kind of suit that belongs to a man who owns things without needing to announce it. He kissed me at the door. He said, "I'll call you when the moment comes." I said, "Don't rush it. Let it arrive naturally." He said, "I know." I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of tea and watched the harbor light come through the east-facing window, and I thought, without bitterness and without triumph, about every morning I had sat at a different table in a different house and felt like a visitor in a family I had not been chosen for. Elliot had been inside the building since 11 in the morning, which was entirely normal. The owner of a venue has both the right and the routine professional habit of being present at his own property during a major event, to ensure everything is running to standard, to address any last-minute issues, to be available to the event team. He had spent most of the day in the upstairs office going through the quarter's financials and answering emails. Hector had been running the ground operations since 8 that morning. Nothing about Elliot's presence in that building was staged, unusual, or remotely questionable. He simply had not yet come downstairs to introduce himself to the client. I arrived on the corner of Broad and Meeting at 2 minutes past 2. The wedding ceremony in the East Garden had ended an hour earlier. The reception had just moved inside to the main hall. 212 people were standing in rooms that I had furnished, in a building I had helped restore, drinking champagne poured by a team I had hired, in a space that the Charleston Home and Garden magazine had described as the finest privately owned event venue in the Low Country. At 11 minutes past 2, Elliot walked down the main staircase, moved through the crowd to where Simone Petit was standing near the catering station, introduced himself by full name, and said calmly, professionally, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been doing this for years, "I'm Elliot Whitfield. This is my property. I try to make a point of welcoming guests personally whenever I can. I hope the day has been everything it was meant to be." Simone Petit went the color of the gardenias in the East Garden. I know this because Elliot described it to me in precise and careful detail on the phone at 11 minutes past 2, while I sat in the car and watched Simone sprint through the front doors and frantically call someone. He said, "Your mother has gone completely still. She is standing in the center of the main hall, and she has not moved a step." I said, "And Becca?" He said, "Becca is looking at the staircase, then at Simone, then at your mother. She hasn't spoken." I said, "And Preston?" He said quietly, "Preston is watching Becca." I said, "Okay." He said, "Your mother just said my last name out loud. She said it in the way people say something when they are testing whether it is real." I said, "What did you do?" He said, "I walked over to her. I shook her hand. I told her it was wonderful to have her daughter's celebration here, that we were honored, that I hoped she'd had a chance to spend some time in the East Garden. Then she asked me how we knew each other. I said, 'What did you say?' He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 'I told her we don't, exactly. I told her I'm married to her daughter Mara. I told her I hoped she knows how much you love this family.'" I sat with that sentence for a while. Outside on the sidewalk, Simone Petit had stopped pacing and was standing very still with her phone at her side. A couple in formal wear came through the front doors laughing about something, stepped around her without noticing, and disappeared inside. The city continued its ordinary business. It always does. My mother called my phone at 2:17. I answered. She said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Is this real?" I said, "Is what real?" She said, "Do you own this building?" I said, "Elliot owns it. We own it together, yes." Another silence. Longer this time, longer than any she had ever given me. She said, "Since when?" I said, "We closed on the acquisition 4 years and 3 months ago." She was quiet for so long I held the phone slightly away from my ear to make sure the call was still connected. Then she said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I said, "No one ever asked what we were building." That landed. I felt it land through the phone the way you feel the shift when something very large and very long-standing finally moves. She said, "Mara." I said, "Mom, today is Becca's wedding day. I want it to be beautiful. I want her to be happy. I want Preston to feel like the luckiest man in that building. Everything has been prepared exactly as Simone requested, and everything is in order. I need you to go back inside and be present for your daughter's wedding." There was a long, full silence. Then, very quietly, she said, "All right." She hung up. I sat in the car until 3:45. I watched the light on the harbor shift from afternoon white to early evening gold. I thought about a girl who had sat at a dining room table being told she was too much, too often, for too many years, and who had gone home and quietly become something else entirely. I thought about what it costs to stay composed when everything in you wants to correct the record. I thought about the 4 years of work, the permits and the inspections and the contractor calls at 6 in the morning and the nights sitting at the kitchen table going through financials and the arguments with the Heritage Board about the tabby steps and the months spent sourcing that heart pine flooring and all of it built while my family ate holiday dinners and decided what I was. At 4 o'clock, I got out of the car, walked across Meeting Street, and went through the front doors of Magnolia Terrace. The foyer was exactly as I had imagined it that first day Elliot and I had stood in it, when it was crumbling and cold and full of old bird nests in the upper moldings, and he had said, I think it could be extraordinary. The new chandeliers caught the late afternoon light the way we had hoped they would. The gardenias were releasing their scent through the ground floor rooms. The sound of the jazz quartet drifted from the main hall. A server in a white jacket offered me a glass of champagne on a silver tray. I took it. I walked through the foyer and stood in the doorway of the main hall. 212 people filled the space. My sister was standing near the garden doors in her wedding dress, laughing at something Preston's father had said. She was genuinely radiant. The dress was beautiful on her. She looked like a woman at the best moment of her life. And I looked at her and felt something that surprised me. Something clean and without edges. I was glad for her. I was genuinely uncomplicated glad. I also want to tell you exactly what the main hall looked like that day, because it matters to me that you see it. The heart pine floors we had restored were glowing in the late afternoon light coming through the transom windows. A warm amber that made the room look like it was lit from inside. The 42 floral arrangements were extraordinary. Our florist, a woman named Cecily Brandt, who had worked with us since our second year, had placed gardenias and white ranunculus and pale green hydrangea in tall mercury glass vessels along every surface, and the effect was somewhere between a garden and a cathedral. The chandeliers we had installed in the foyer were casting fractured gold light across the entry. The catering team was moving to the room with a quiet efficiency that Hector had spent years building into their standard. Every element was exactly as we had planned it, exactly as we had worked for, exactly as we had imagined it could be the first time we walked through a crumbling, bird-nested, heritage-listed ruin on a cold November afternoon and said, "Worth it." My mother saw me first. She was near the far table with my father, and she went very still when she saw me cross the foyer threshold. My father followed her gaze. He looked at me for a long moment across the width of the main hall, and then he did something I had not expected. He crossed the room. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. The way he moved when he had decided something and was no longer looking out any windows. He stood in front of me and said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Mara. I should have said something a long time ago. Not just today. A long time ago." I looked at my father's face, his pale blue eyes, the lines around them, the way he had gone a little gray since he retired. I said, "I know, Dad." He nodded once. He touched my shoulder, the pat that always contained more than he had words for. He said, "It's a remarkable place." I said, "We're proud of it." Becca found me at 20 minutes past 4. She went still the way my mother had, but different. There was something in her face I hadn't seen in a very long time. Something that looked like reckoning, but not unkind. She crossed the room. She said, "You came." I said, "I'm here." She looked at me and said very carefully, "Mara, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Did you know when the venue was booked? Did you already know?" I said, "Yes." The contract came through our business inbox. She looked at me with an expression I didn't quite have a name for. She said, "And you let us have it anyway." I said, "It's a wedding, Becca." "Of course I let you have it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell us about any of it? About what you and Elliot had built?" I said, "Would it have mattered?" She held my gaze. She didn't answer because we both already knew the answer lived somewhere uncomfortable, and this was not the day to live there. I said, "You look beautiful. Preston is a good man. I'm truly happy for you." I raised my champagne glass very slightly. She looked at me, really looked at me, the way she hadn't since we were 9 and 7 with our island game. And then she pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than I had expected, and that held more than either of us said. I stayed for 2 hours. I watched my sister and Preston dance to a Norah Jones song I had always loved. I watched my father stand with Elliot in the East Garden for 45 minutes, and I watched my father laugh. A real laugh, not the polite social one. Twice in that conversation. I watched my mother from across the room for most of the 2 hours. She spent the time moving through her guests, attending to her duties as the mother of the bride, and she did not approach me. That was fine. She was processing. She had earned the right to take the time she needed. Elliot and I left at 6:30. We drove home through Charleston in the early evening with the windows down and the salt air moving through the car. He didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Quiet." He said, "Good quiet or bad quiet?" I said, "The kind that comes after you've been carrying something for a long time and you finally put it down somewhere safe." In the weeks that followed, my mother called twice. The first call was 4 days after the wedding. She said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I said, "I have too." She said, "I don't think I have always seen you clearly. I think I decided who you were a long time ago and I stopped looking." I said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to change that." I said, "I would like that too." We talked for 45 minutes. Not about the venue, not about what happened, but about things we had not spoken of honestly in years. It was halting and imperfect and real, which made it the best conversation we had managed in a decade. The second call, 2 weeks later, was to invite Elliot and me to Sunday brunch. She said, "I want to hear about the business. All of it. From the beginning. From when you first started." I said we would be there. In the months since, people have asked me, when I tell the story privately, to the few people I trust with it, whether I feel guilty, whether there was a moment where I should have picked up the phone and said, "Mom, you should know something about the venue you just booked." I have thought about that question, honestly. I have not found guilt in the answer. What I have found is this. I had spent 15 years trying to tell my family things, in every way I knew how, through achievements, through choices, through the patience of showing up at their table over and over again. And those things had landed exactly nowhere. The information was not the problem, the listening was. And you cannot fix someone's willingness to listen by changing the information you offer. You can only change what you do with the space they've left empty. I want to be careful about what I call this experience, because I have spent time with it, and I do not want to call it revenge. Revenge is something you do to someone. What I did was simply decline to stop building while someone was insisting I was less than I was. I did not engineer a fall. I did not arrange a humiliation. I married a man I loved. I built a business I was proud of. And I honored a contract that happened to arrive in my hands because my family had made a choice without asking who they were dealing with. The truth had its own architecture. I simply stayed in my lane and let it stand. What I know now that I could not have told you at 25 is this. The people who underestimate you, quietly, are giving you a gift. They are clearing the room of their expectations. They are freeing you from the obligation to perform your progress for an audience that has already decided what you are, which means you can build without explaining yourself, without justifying each choice, without shrinking what you're doing to a size they'll accept. Every time my mother dismissed Elliot at a dinner table, she was confirming that she wasn't watching, and that meant we were free to work without interruption. The silence they created around us was not a wound, it was a workshop. There is a version of this story where I walked into that building angry, where I staged this moment for maximum effect, where the point was to make someone feel small. That version would have been so much smaller than what actually happened. Anger would have made it about them. What I chose made it about us, about Elliot and me, about the work, about who we had become. That is the only story I want to tell. There is a version of this story where I walked into that building, angry, where I staged this moment for maximum effect, where the point was to make someone feel small. That version would have been so much smaller than what actually happened. Anger would have made it about them. What I chose made it about us, about Elliot and me, about the work, about who we had become. The goal was never a scene. The goal was always just the life. I also want to say something about my sister, because I think she deserves it. In the months after the wedding, Becca called me 3 times. The first call was short. She said she had thought about what I said at the reception and she wanted to know if we could have lunch. We did. The second call was longer. She told me that growing up, she had always felt like she was performing for our mother in a way that had cost her. and that she hadn't known how to stop. I didn't tell her I had felt the same. I just listened. The third call was on my birthday in July, and she sang happy birthday off-key down the phone the way she had when we were children. I laughed. I had not laughed like that in years. Becca and I are not fixed. Families that have been organized around one child's elevation and another's diminishment don't fix in a phone call or a wedding afternoon, but we are honest with each other now in a way we never were. That matters more than I expected it to. If you are in a family right now that has told you, with words or with the long accumulated weight of many small silences, that you are less than the golden child, less than your sister, less than the easy one, I want you to hear this very clearly. Your value does not require their recognition to be real. You do not need to correct them. You do not need to wait for their apology before you begin. You only need to keep building. Quietly. Consistently. Without asking for anyone's permission. The day will come, it always comes, when the building speaks for itself. And it will say everything you never had to say out loud. The loudest comebacks really are built in silence. I know that now the way I know very few things, not as a phrase but as something that happened in my body over 4 years of ordinary mornings and patient work and a choice made over and over again to keep going without an audience. Have you ever been excluded from something only to discover later that you were already holding more than they knew? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and your story matters more than you think. To everyone who listened to this one all the way through, thank you. Not because you stayed, but because something in this story found something in yours, and that is the only reason any of this is worth telling. Thank you so much for being here with us at Revenge Chronicles. If this story reached you, if it found something in your chest that needed to be found, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it this week. We are a small team, and we pour everything we have into every story we tell. Your being here is the reason we keep going. Every single week, we come back with another story of a woman who was overlooked, underestimated, or pushed to the side, and who let her actions do the speaking, that her words never needed to. These stories are for you. They have always been for you. We'll see you next week. Keep building. Keep going. And remember, the quietest women in the room are very often holding everything.